What if your life depended on building a shelter in the next 60 minutes, using only sticks, moss, and your bare hands? For Spartan warriors, this life or death scenario wasn't hypothetical. The Spartan training system was built to make boys tough for exactly these situations. From childhood, they lived with little food, poor shelter, and thin clothes. They went barefoot in summer and winter. This harsh training prepared them for when survival skills would mean life or death. Even the toughest Spartan knew when to build shelter instead of just trying to endure. When marching through enemy territory in winter, you need rest and warmth to stay ready for battle. You can't tough it out every night and expect to survive. The Spartans developed a system for building functional winter shelters in 1 hour using only their hands and natural materials. No special tools, no fancy equipment. Just survival knowledge passed down through generations of warriors who understood a brutal truth. You don't need the perfect shelter. You need one that works, built fast enough that you don't die while making it. Here's exactly how they did it. The first step was always finding the perfect location. Spartans looked for three main things: natural wind protection, available building materials, and safety from enemies. The ideal spot had something already there to work with. A fallen tree was perfect because it gave them a ready-made backbone for their shelter. Rock formations worked too, or even small dips in the ground that could serve as a foundation. Why build everything from scratch when nature had already done half the work? A fallen log meant they already had their ridgeline. A natural depression meant protection from wind. These features saved precious time and energy. They always checked that their chosen foundation was stable. A log that might roll under pressure was useless. A rock formation that could shift was dangerous. Safety came first, even when they were in a hurry. Wind direction mattered enormously. Their wool cloaks provided some protection from cold, but wind could turn that protection into a liability if it got inside their shelter. They studied the area to understand which way the wind typically blew. The best locations were slightly lower than the surrounding ground. These spots stayed protected from wind but didn't collect water when it rained or when snow melted. Higher ground might seem better, but water always runs downhill. Material availability was crucial. The perfect spot meant nothing if they had to walk long distances to find branches and insulation. They scanned the immediate area for dead trees, fallen branches, and natural materials like moss or dried grass. Even while choosing shelter locations, Spartans thought like soldiers. They avoided obvious spots like clearings that might attract enemy attention. They preferred hidden areas that still gave them access to materials and escape routes if needed. The ground itself had to be right. Rocky soil was uncomfortable and hard to work with, but it drained well. Muddy areas were warmer but could become swamps. The best ground was firm enough to work with but soft enough to clear easily. Once they found their spot, Spartans moved fast and smart. They gathered materials in a specific order that saved time and energy. Structural pieces came first, meaning the logs and branches that would hold everything else up. Dead wood was always their first choice. It weighed less than living wood and broke easier. They looked for branches roughly as long as a man's height. Thick enough to provide real protection, but not so thick they couldn't break them by hand. Breaking branches required smart technique rather than brute force. Spartans would find a sturdy tree trunk or large rock to brace against, then position the branch so the breaking point was right next to this solid support. Using quick, controlled pressure, they could snap even thick branches cleanly by letting the leverage do most of the work instead of relying on raw muscle power. For thicker pieces, they wedged wood between two trees and used their body weight to break it. This saved their hands from damage. Injured hands meant a dead warrior, so they protected their most important tools with dedication. While gathering structural wood, they kept their eyes open for other useful materials. Moss, pine needles, dead grass, and bark all served as insulation and weather protection. The trick was collecting these as they went, not making separate trips that wasted time. Spartans learned to identify good materials quickly through countless hours of training. Fresh green moss held too much water and was too heavy. The best moss was slightly dried, but still thick enough to insulate well. It should peel away from trees or ground in large sheets, not crumble into small pieces. Pine needles were gathered in armfuls. They focused on brown, dried needles that had already fallen rather than pulling green ones from living branches. Dried needles were lighter, lasted longer, and trapped more air for better insulation. Bark came only from dead trees. Living trees needed their bark to survive, and Spartans understood the importance of not damaging their environment unnecessarily. Dead bark often came off in large sheets that worked like natural roof tiles. The collection process was methodical and efficient. They worked in a rough circle around their shelter site, gathering materials in order of importance. Everything got brought back to a central area. This prevented wasted motion and ensured they didn't miss good materials nearby. The shelter design was straightforward and what we call an A-frame today. Simple, stable, and fast to build even in harsh conditions. The fallen log served as the ridgeline, and branches leaned against it create the basic structure. They always started from the bottom and worked up. This let them test the size as they built and avoid making the shelter bigger than necessary. Remember, these warriors were practical above all else. A shelter that was too large took more time, used more materials, and was harder to keep warm. Support branches got angled slightly forward, leaning into the ridgeline rather than straight up and down. This prevented branches from sliding off and created a more stable structure. Natural bumps and branch stubs on the ridgeline helped hold everything in place. Each branch was positioned to overlap with its neighbors, creating a solid framework that could support the weight of insulation materials. Spartans knew that a frame collapsing in the middle of the night could mean death. The entrance always faced away from the prevailing wind. They left just enough space to crawl in and out, but not so much that heat would escape or enemies could easily spot the opening. Spacing between support branches was critical. Too far apart and insulation materials would fall through or leave gaps. Too close together, and they wasted materials and time. The ideal spacing was roughly the width of a man's hand between each branch. As they built, Spartans tested stability by gently pushing against the frame and checking for wobbling or shifting. A stable frame was essential because once insulation was added, structural adjustments became much harder. Shelter height was kept deliberately low. A taller structure might seem more comfortable, but it was harder to heat and more visible to enemies. The ideal height lets a warrior sit up inside but not stand. This kept the internal space small enough to warm with body heat alone. The angle of shelter walls was typically around 45 degrees, steep enough to shed rain and snow effectively, but not so steep it became unstable or required too many materials. With the frame complete, the next step was making the shelter weatherproof. This is where all those extra materials came into play. Moss was particularly valuable because it worked as both insulation and a water barrier. They worked from bottom to top, layering moss like roof shingles. Each layer overlapped the one below it, so water would run off instead of seeping through. The moss had to be packed tight enough to block wind, but not so tight it lost its insulating properties. Pine needles and dead grass got stuffed into any remaining gaps. These materials were excellent at trapping air, which was the key to staying warm. Spartans understood that dead airspace kept their body heat from escaping into the cold night. Bark from dead trees could cover larger sections of the shelter. They wedged pieces of bark between support branches, creating a more solid barrier against wind and snow. The thickness of insulation depended on weather conditions and available materials. In extreme cold, they might build up layers several inches thick. In milder conditions, a thinner layer might be sufficient. The key to effective insulation was creating multiple layers with different materials. The outer layer needed to resist weather, moss, and bark worked well for this. The middle layer was all about trapping air, pine needles, and dried grass were perfect. The inner layer, closest to the shelter interior, needed to be comfortable and not irritating to skin. Spartans paid special attention to areas where support branches met the ridgeline. These junction points were natural weak spots where wind and water could penetrate. They packed extra insulation around these areas and sometimes used strips of bark to create better seals. The entrance area required special treatment. It couldn't be completely sealed because they needed to get in and out, but it also couldn't be left completely open. They created partial barriers that could be adjusted based on wind conditions and weather. The final step was testing the insulation by lying inside and checking for cold spots or drafts. Any areas where cold air was getting through got identified and fixed before nightfall. This testing was crucial because problems that seemed minor during the day could become life threatening at night. The inside of the shelter was just as important as the outside. Sleeping directly on frozen ground was a sure way to lose body heat and potentially freeze to death. Spartans had several proven techniques for creating a sleeping surface that would keep them warm through the night. Dead grass and pine needles were piled up to create a thick mattress. This layer needed to be deep enough to provide insulation from the ground, but not so deep it became unstable. The ideal thickness was roughly the width of a man's hand. When available, they laid their cloak over this bedding material. Spartan cloaks were made of wool, which provided additional insulation and helped retain body heat. The space inside was kept deliberately small. A larger space would be harder to heat with body warmth alone. Spartans rarely built fires inside their shelters unless absolutely necessary. Fire meant smoke, and smoke could give away their position to enemies. The 1 hour time frame was often a necessity. Enemy scouts might be nearby. Storms could be moving in, or orders might come to move out at dawn. There was no luxury of taking time to build the perfect shelter. Spartans could meet this deadline because every movement was purposeful and practiced. A typical sequence looked like this: 5 minutes to find and evaluate the location, 10 minutes to gather main structural materials, 15 minutes to build the frame, 20 minutes to collect and apply insulation, and 10 minutes to prepare the interior. If they had 45 minutes and materials were scarce, they built a smaller shelter with thinner insulation. If they had 90 minutes and materials were abundant, they might add extra features. But the basic shelter would be functional and protective, regardless of time constraints. Speed came from experience and repetition. During their training in the Agog, young Spartans practiced these techniques countless times. They learned to identify good materials at a glance, to judge structural stability by feel, and to work efficiently even when exhausted or under stress. The pressure of real combat situations only reinforced these skills. When your life depends on getting shelter built before nightfall, you learn to work fast without making mistakes. Every wasted motion could mean the difference between warmth and freezing to death. Spartans also learned to work as teams when multiple warriors were present. While one man selected the site and began the frame, others could be gathering materials or preparing the sleeping area. This division of labor could cut building time significantly while ensuring nothing important got overlooked. Experienced Spartan soldiers developed several variations for extreme weather conditions. When snow was deep, they learned to build on elevated platforms made from logs and branches. This kept them off the frozen ground and prevented snow from melting under their body heat and soaking their bedding. In areas with limited materials, they mastered techniques for building effective shelters with minimal resources. A shelter built against a large rock or cliff face required only half the usual materials, since the natural formation provided one complete wall. They learned to identify these terrain features quickly and use them to their advantage. When building in windy conditions, they developed methods for anchoring their structures more securely. Large rocks could be used to weigh down the base of the shelter, or they could dig shallow trenches to partially bury the lower edges of their insulation layers. For situations where stealth was critical, they learned to build shelters that were virtually invisible from a distance. Using materials that matched the surrounding terrain and keeping the profile low made their shelters blend into the landscape. These concealed shelters took slightly longer to build, but could mean the difference between safety and discovery by enemy forces. In forested areas with abundant fallen timber, they sometimes built more elaborate structures with multiple rooms or storage areas. These larger shelters could house equipment or supplies that needed protection from the elements. The extra space also allowed for small, smokeless fires when the tactical situation permitted. Water management was crucial for shelter survival. Rain, snow, and condensation could quickly turn a warm shelter into a death trap. Spartans learned several techniques for keeping their shelters dry and preventing moisture problems. Proper drainage around the shelter site was essential. They would dig small channels to direct water away from their sleeping area. Even a shallow groove could prevent water from pooling under their shelter during heavy rain or snowmelt. Inside the shelter, they positioned their bedding materials to allow air circulation while preventing drafts. This delicate balance kept moisture from building up while maintaining warmth. They learned to recognize the early signs of condensation problems and adjust their ventilation accordingly. When building in areas prone to flooding or heavy runoff, they selected sites on higher ground or built raised sleeping platforms. A few extra minutes spent on proper site selection could prevent hours of misery later when water started flowing through poorly positioned shelters. The Spartan approach to winter shelter worked because it was based on solid survival principles. They understood that the biggest threats were wind, moisture, and ground cold. Their shelter design addressed all three. The A-frame structure was inherently stable and could shed snow and rain effectively. The layered insulation trapped warm air while blocking cold air. The raised sleeping area prevented ground cold from sapping body heat. Most importantly, the shelter was sized appropriately for one person. Just big enough for a warrior to lie down and sleep, but small enough that his body heat could warm the entire space. The materials they used were readily available in most environments where they might need shelter. What really made the system work was the mindset behind it. Spartans were trained from childhood to endure hardship without complaint. This conditioning was crucial. When you're already used to being cold, a shelter that provides even basic protection feels like luxury. The Spartan Agoge deliberately exposed boys to harsh conditions from an early age. They slept on hard surfaces, wore minimal clothing, and learned to find comfort in basic survival. This was preparation for the reality they would face as warriors. By the time they became full soldiers, building emergency shelters was second nature. They had practiced these skills hundreds of times under supervision, then hundreds more times in real combat situations. The mental aspect was just as important as the physical skills. Spartans were taught to assess situations quickly and make decisions without hesitation. In shelter building, this meant committing to a site and design immediately rather than wasting precious time reconsidering options. They also learned to work through discomfort and fatigue. Building shelter when you're already exhausted from marching and fighting requires mental discipline. The ability to focus on essential tasks while ignoring pain and tiredness was a crucial survival skill. The Spartans understood that survival often came down to doing ordinary things extraordinarily well under pressure. Their shelter building system worked because it focused on fundamentals and could be executed reliably even under the worst conditions. The warrior mindset also meant accepting calculated risks. They knew their shelters weren't perfect, but they also knew that a good enough shelter built quickly was better than a perfect shelter that took too long to complete. This pragmatic approach to risk management kept them alive in situations where perfectionism would have meant death. Of course, we should remember that not every Spartan shelter building session was successful. Some warriors froze to death on campaign. Some shelters collapsed in storms. Some groups got caught by enemies while they were building. The difference was that the Spartans accepted these risks as part of their reality. They trained for the worst case scenarios and developed techniques that gave them the best chance of survival. But they never pretended that survival was guaranteed. This acceptance of risk allowed them to make decisions quickly and commit fully to their chosen course of action. The brutal truth is that their shelter building skills were developed through necessity, not choice. They lived in a world where failing to build adequate shelter could mean death. And that stark reality motivated them to master these techniques in ways that modern people rarely experience. So, the next time you're struggling to set up a modern tent or complaining about camping conditions, remember the Spartan warriors who could build a life saving shelter in an hour using nothing but their hands and whatever nature provided. Their ability to build effective shelter in just 1 hour was the result of their hard training, practical knowledge, and the kind of mental toughness that comes from facing real consequences for failure. In their world, a good shelter meant the difference between life and death, and that reality shaped every aspect of how they approached the challenge.